There you go. Perfect.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Sorry about that. Again, thank you to Bree and Alex and the WLA for putting this together and for inviting me. And I very much appreciate the chance to connect. Remotely is not as good as in person, but we're doing what we can here. I changed the title. History of Federal Land Management was simply more than I could do in half an hour. So I narrowed it slightly to a history of federal rangeland management. And I will be going quickly to try to capture all of this as best I can and still leave time for questions. So this slide, I think I start here because it gives you a good sense of how people in this country typically have thought about rangelands, which is to say that they haven't. They've thought about forests and they've thought about croplands, and rangelands sort of fall out of the picture as whatever's left, the non-forested residual category. Here, as you can see, it's basically all that gray stuff in the middle of the continent. And for most Americans, most of the time, that sort of is the conditions of rangelands. And that's actually part of what has gotten us to where we are in the current situation with federal rangelands. Next slide, please. Beginning in during the Civil War and after the Civil War, the federal government's policies for the settlement of the West focused largely, almost exclusively, on trying to get people out there who would farm the land. That was the vision. It was Jeffersonian, it was agrarian. The Homestead Act offered people the prospect of 160 acres if they would move out there, improve it, and live on it. Over time, the policies were amended or added to make that acreage larger in recognition that there were many places where 160 acres was just not going to work for a livelihood. But the focus remained on trying to settle as many people as possible, and it was still basically an agrarian vision. The Homestead Act remained in effect until 1976, when it was repealed by the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. By that time, about 10% of the United States had been privatized, some 270 million acres. Next slide. The fact that the policies did not really envision livestock grazing as a primary use of much of this land resulted in some serious problems. When there were serious droughts and large numbers of uncontrolled livestock on rangelands in places like southern Arizona, there was a resulting catastrophe. You see pictures here from 1893 and 1903 in southern Arizona, piles of bones of dead cattle from drought. This was the circumstance that gave rise to public rangeland administration and range science in the United States. It was a response to a crisis, and those responses were colored by the shortcomings, the blind spots of those who engaged the situation, who defined the problem and proposed solutions. This report from the Public Lands Commission, Teddy Roosevelt, Jack mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt convened a commission in 1903, and 2 years later they produced this report, which became the statutory blueprint for the 1905 Forest Transfer Act, which created the national forests. The goal was explicitly stated as the maximum number of settler households. They wanted to give people enough land to have a livelihood, but not more, because they wanted to give the land away to as many people as possible. They proposed a system of leases that would parcel out the public domain, or at least the forest lands, the lands reserved as forests, and charge fees for it and fence them so that livestock numbers could be controlled. And it included this passage, I quote, "The great bulk of the vacant public lands throughout the West are, and probably always must be, of chief value for grazing." This was a key assumption underlying the whole system. This slide, I probably don't need to go into detail with this audience for this slide. The Western Range is the name that came to be attached to this system. It's not a place or a type of land, it's a system of land tenure and administration and use. It combines, it unifies federal public grazing lands with private lands into larger management units that are integrated in ways that could not otherwise be possible. And it rests on the incentive to conserve rangelands that is there, provided that there is no higher use for them, right? Provided that people are They have a secure, sustained, long-term investment in the value, the sustainability, productivity of those lands. This is Gifford Pinchot. He was on that Public Lands Commission, and he was the first head of the Forest Service that was created by the Transfer Act. He was a visionary conservationist. He defined conservation as sustained productive use, the kind of working lands that we heard about earlier, with the goal of the permanent good of the whole people. And he said in a memo in 1905 that in the management of each reserve, local questions will be decided upon local grounds. He recognized the importance of people having discretion to make decisions based on the circumstances they faced in each place. Pinchot was a forester. He wasn't a rangelands person. He did, however, recruit and cooperate with a series of people with more expertise in rangelands and grassland ecology. If we go around the circle here, at the upper left is Charles Vesey, a famous ecologist at the University of Nebraska. On the upper right is his student, Frederick Clements, who is even more famous, plant ecologist. Clements in turn trained the gentleman in the lower center, who's Arthur Samson. Top center is Alfred Potter, a sheep raiser from Arizona who was recruited by Pinchot to head the grazing program in the Forest Service. Lower left is Frederick Colville, and the lower right is James Jardine. Colville recruited Samson from Clements's lab in Nebraska, and he recruited Jardine off of a ranch in Utah and sent them to Oregon to implement what was to be the most important early experiment in range science. Samson, working from Clements taught Samson about plant succession, taught him this framework you see pictured here. I won't go into details unless it comes up in Q&A, but this was the framework that Clements had devised in studying the grasslands of Nebraska. And it was the framework that Samson would then use to understand the response of rangelands in Eastern Oregon to sheep grazing. Here are some pictures from their famous experiment, which was called the Coyote-proof pasture experiment. Suffice to say that the Jardine became head of administration for the Forest Service for grazing lands. Samson became the most important early professor of range science here at Berkeley. And they basically designed the administration side and the science side of rangeland, how we would deal with rangelands in the United States. Hugely influential. Two things that came out of that. One was building lots of fences. Another was eliminating predators, because one of their goals was, in fact, to reduce the labor costs of raising livestock. And fences that kept out predators were too expensive. But if you got rid of the predators and you had fences, then you didn't need so many cowboys or herders to keep track of your animals. This slide attempts to capture what Samson did with Clements. If Clements gave us that top line, the stages of succession from rock and lichens to trees and climax, Samson gave us the bottom line, that the harder you graze a piece of land, the more you will push it backwards on that successional spectrum. And then he put them together to give us the figure in the middle there. Ray, if you could go back for just a second. The idea that the two forces would oppose each other in a kind of, in a way that could be controlled by adjusting your stocking rate. That the more animals you had, the harder you would push it backwards. But if you lighten those stocking rates up, you could basically peg the vegetation to whatever vegetation community you wanted. Next slide. All that's well and good up to a point that this was still the Forest Service. It was not the grazing service. The focus was trees and timber. And Earl Clapp, in the upper left here, was the head of research for the Forest Service for 20 years. He oversaw the writing of the National Program of Forest Research, which was published in 1926, and which helped inform the National Plan for American Forestry. And he also, what he did was he said, timber is more important than range. Fire is a threat to timber. We will therefore use grazing as a way to prevent fires. And you see him pictured in the lower left here, standing behind FDR, admiring a poster, admonishing Americans not to let fires burn in the forests. He also, in that 1926 report, decided that Samson's adaptation of successional theory would be the framework for range science around, going forward as he expanded the research program for the Forest Service. And one of the key things there was precisely that you could peg your stocking rate at whatever that carrying capacity was, and it would help you fight fires, because it would mean that there were effectively, you were grazing heavily during droughts, effectively, because there was less forage, but the same number of animals, and you would graze lightly during wet periods, and hope that it made up the damage that might have been done during the drought. The result, as you can see in this table, was a kind of stalemate, a kind of impasse, in which agencies and ranchers battled each other back and forth for decades about stocking rates, with the agencies always concerned that they were overgrazing during drier periods, and the ranchers always frustrated that they were not being allowed to graze as much as they should during wet periods, and the rangeland basically stagnating or not changing particularly much. You see here for the latter part of this period, basically most of the land wasn't changing much at all. The permitted numbers over time sort of slowly declined, but the expected recovery towards climax in general did not materialize. Next slide. Meanwhile, the highest and best use of rangelands in much of the country ceased to be grazing quite some time ago. You see here the patterns of exurban development in the second half of the 20th century, concentrated actually in across the country, but heavily affecting the Western US and rangelands. In the lower left is a simple table. It doesn't even include rangelands or livestock grazing as one of the uses of these lands, but it gives you some sense of the amount of money that can be made in converting agricultural land to more intensive uses in residential development. So the ecologists are well aware of this, but they don't often reflect on the ways in which this undermines that system of leases and the assumption that the highest and best use of these lands would be grazing, and therefore those who lease them would have an incentive, a natural incentive to keep conserving them. Next slide. It seems to be fading in between here. Oh, you've got the fader going on. Okay. So how am I doing for time? I'm trying to keep moving here. What are the lessons here from this history? The first is that rangelands aren't forests and they aren't croplands, and you shouldn't think of them that way because they don't behave that way. And it's likely that you'll mismanage them if you bring either of those kinds of frames to your definition of the situation and the problem. The second is that variability is the norm, and that means flexibility is key. This is a map of the coefficient of variation of interannual rainfall. The next slide has got a series of figures illustrating variation in rainfall in the semi-desert grassland, variation in productivity in different rangeland types. Those numbers under forage production range sometimes by an order of magnitude between dry years and wet years. There's also some evidence that precipitation variability is actually increasing, possibly as a result of climate change. The difficulty of matching your stocking rate to the actual forage rather than some average number is at the center of good range management. And we know that, but the systems we built, courtesy of people like Earl Clapp, actually make it very difficult to have that kind of flexibility in managing public rangelands. Next slide. Also, scale matters. It's dangerous to scale up in some simple linear way from a small plot where you've done an experiment to a entire allotment or a ranch, let alone a watershed or a whole region. Scaling relationships simply aren't always linear. And for practical and ecological reasons, we need to manage at those landscape scales, which means we need to be a lot more flexible and a lot more creative in thinking about how to understand the dynamics over these scales. And it also means we need to work across land ownerships and across jurisdictions. The Western Range system tied public to private, but in a lot of places you've got different kinds of public land. You've got multiple lessees who are intermixing. You've got overlays of wildlife or watershed issues that make things even more complicated. Next lesson, ranchers are not economically rational. You can go ahead to the next slide. This is something that the social scientists have established now for better than 40 years. Ranchers don't do this because it's the easiest way to make money or the highest return investment on their capital. They do this because they love it. They do it because they are attached to the landscape, the community, the livelihood, their families. And this is actually the foundation or a foundation of conservation, precisely because what it means is that they resist that economically rational temptation to cash out, to sell their private land and let it turn into a bunch of money they can put in the bank. The opportunity cost that they absorb in not developing their lands is absolutely foundational. Jack mentioned earlier, the private lands tend to be the highest value habitat, tend to be where the water is. There are obvious reasons for that. And that makes it all the more important that we recognize this and actually embrace the apparent irrationality of ranchers. Excellent. Don't expect science to solve political issues, and don't let politics decide the science. This, I think, resonates nicely with some of Jared's comments, right? The history that I've found for this topic suggests that science is always affected by politics. It always has been, but that doesn't mean it's always corrupt or wrong, nor that it's not potentially very useful. Judging from the history, I would say that it's actually the non-scientists, including administrators of the Forest Service and other agencies, politicians, including some quite powerful ones, and ranchers as well, who have more frequently than the scientists jumped to conclusions, expected their answers or found them prematurely, pressured, walked in with a solution to looking for a problem, for example, and pressured the scientists to exaggerate the certainty of their findings. They wanted science more as a cudgel than as a means of finding our way forward. I think there are a couple more slides. Next, collaboration requires trust, and trust requires humility. This is true. This extends to the scientists as well as everyone else in the room. There are other ways of learning, other varieties of knowledge that are every bit as valuable in achieving quality management of complex landscapes as scientific knowledge or scientific experiments. I would note in closing that cooperation or collaboration has in fact been a centerpiece of the legal landscape for federal rangelands from the very beginning. Each of these statutes included or was intended to facilitate collaboration between, for instance, federal, state, and county governments, between ranchers and university extension agencies and researchers, and between lessees and the agencies whose land they were leasing. The Mizpah Pumpkin Creek Grazing Association is a particularly forgotten, but I think very important example. It was in fact the test case, the pilot that led to the Taylor Grazing Act, by helping persuade ranchers that this could be done in a way that they could live with, a kind of collaborative effort to manage large landscapes. So it's not a new idea. It's an idea that in many cases has been embraced and put forward, and in some cases even legislated, but then has struggled to be realized, as we all know. I think that's it. I will stop there and just say thank you again.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Every time I hear that, I learn something new. And as I said, I'm still making my way through your book and learning a lot. Let's see. So we are behind schedule, but I want to check in because Nathan, are you going to be able to stay with us through some more of the day?
I am good for at least the next half an hour.
Okay.
Then I'm going to have to go off and teach. It'll be hard for me to come back later. My afternoon is pretty clogged up.
Okay, totally understand. I just wanted to check in to see, because maybe if folks have some questions, we could take a few minutes to do a couple of questions for either Nathan or Jared. And then we will go into our next session. So there is a question here. Please comment on what you believe is the purpose of collaboration. Do you believe in collaboration for collaboration's sake or to achieve outcomes? What do you do when collaboration gets stuck?
Jerry, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure, I will. First, I might just shamelessly plug, stay tuned this afternoon for the next version of my talk, because I do talk about the purpose and motivation of collaboration. I don't think there is a purpose. I think there's multiple purposes, and I think that's actually one of the reasons it does get stuck. Sometimes people have different purposes to collaborate and don't negotiate that beforehand. So that's the really cop-out answer, is that stay tuned. We'll talk about that this afternoon. I think the real lesson is we need to talk more. We do, there's the thing we're collaborating about, but we're also collaborating, and we don't often talk about collaborating enough. So when they get stuck, when any collaboration gets stuck that I've been a part of, my first reaction is to stop what we're doing and talk about why we're stuck. And that is not something that people do often enough. And I think it needs to be normalized in collaboration to talk about what we're doing when we're working together. So.
It's funny, I might add that in some cases it's fruitful to agree to disagree and move on to other things. It may be that there are topics where you simply don't agree and that's just the way it is, but it's quite possible that there are still other areas where you can find a way to work together. Collaboration for collaboration's sake, I would say, is not a good idea, or at least it's not an end in itself. I suppose there are contexts in which, like, learning to collaborate may require saying, we're going to figure out how to collaborate. Well, we're going to talk until we find something we can collaborate on. And it might be a real important step away from a more top-down or one-sided relationship that has prevailed up until that point. But if you haven't got both something that you can work on together and the latitude to actually implement some solution that you come up with together, collaboration might start to feel a little bit fruitless, or like you're just play acting. And most people I know are too busy to do that very much.
Yeah, very much so. We've heard that a lot from folks, that collaboration takes a lot of time and it needs to be meaningful, and showing up just for the sake of it can often feel like a waste of time, and that there needs to be a goal and a structure for collaboration that includes all those involved. Nathan, I do have a question, but I think this could potentially be a whole entire another session. I am really interested in hearing more from you about your last slide there, talking about the legal context for collaboration within the lands policy. And I don't know if you have a quick response to that. I feel like that could be a happy hour session.
Yeah, I mean, you can find in the archives and in the statutory language a real tension from the earliest sort of debates around these questions between local, more democratic, more sort of grassroots, grounds up needs and efforts and principles, like philosophies, and federal level or national level political realities and administrative impulses. I mean, it's still not clear to me that that you can have nationwide uniformity of policies for managing these lands and have it actually work, because these lands are so varied and so diverse and so unpredictable and so variable. I've been thinking recently about Native Californians' management of fire. And if you are in a place where you know fire is a really important tool and you might need to use it like annually, at least in some places, being able to make those decisions at the scale of like a really local community, most of the tribes that sort of perfected this, as far as we can tell, they managed a piece of land that was maybe 15 miles from end to end, 15 miles in diameter, something like that. And you had maybe 1,000 people there. And they decided when to burn, how much to burn, how, that kind of thing. Like, because they knew that hillside, right? They knew the time of day, they knew the weather, that, like what a fire would do. That's the kind of really fine-grained management flexibility and discretion that I think may in fact be needed for a lot of these landscapes. The statutes, of course, come out of the federal government. They're crafted in DC because these are federal lands. And they have a bureaucratic logic that demands a kind of uniformity and an accountability, this like up the chain kind of thing. Like, imagine you see that today, right now, if I light a match on this hillside, I'll get exactly the burn I want. But you got to send a memo, and that memo's got to make its way to Albuquerque and then to DC and then all the way back down again. You'll never get that fire done, right?
Yep. Thank you for that. I think that leads us into our next talk, which is all about flexibility with accountability on a matrix of land management.